Hey everyone, I'm Mike Settele, and in this lesson, I'm going to answer the question, when should you take practice tests as part of your SAT prep? It's an important question. We don't want to waste those practice tests. A few things to remember that I've talked about in other lessons about practice tests. Number one, you should be taking all of your SAT practice tests in the College Board's Blue Book app. That is where you take digital tests. Don't take them with paper and pencil. Don't take those linear, non-adaptive tests. Don't worry about other sites. You want to take the official tests in the Blue Book app. However, there are only a limited number of tests in that app, so we have to be careful and not just blow through them too quickly. We need to strategize when we're going to take those tests so we can get the most value for that time. And that's kind of the overall theme of this lesson, is that practice tests are a special part of your prep. They are only a part of it. There are other things you're going to need to do to learn new strategies and practice specific topics. So practice tests are an important part, but they are not everything. So you've got to make sure that you're using them when they're going to get the most value for your improvement into your score. So let's talk about a few mistakes that people make as they're preparing and overusing these practice tests. First, some people just think that they should casually take a test just to see where they're starting from. Well, that's what the PSAT was for. The PSAT gave you starting scores so you can see what you're going to be doing to improve those scores. So we don't need to start our SAT prep with a practice test. You've already done that. Now, if you didn't take a PSAT for some reason, then maybe yes, it does make sense to start with a practice test, but don't waste one of the SAT practice tests. Use one of the PSAT practice tests instead. So again, you can get a starting score without spoiling the very valuable and limited SAT practice test that we're going to use later. Some people also think that we just want to kind of get used to the app itself and understand like what it feels like to take a test. Again, the PSAT does that, but if you're just looking to experiment with the app, they do have a test preview feature that I talk about in another lesson, and you can use that to find out where all the buttons are without wasting a practice test. So don't just dive right in. We're going to use a practice test only when we've actually learned something and we can see if we've improved from our prior scores. And that gets to another idea. We don't want to take a practice test and then just move on. The scores are only part of what we get from a practice test. So yes, we want to see how that compares to our PSATs or our prior SATs, but mostly we want to see what can we do differently to improve that score even further. So I've got another lesson that's specifically about how to review tests in the most efficient, effective way. So make sure you watch that lesson. But basically, you've got to look at every single question that you got wrong, that you had trouble with, any sort of topic that you struggled with. It's much more than just seeing what the wrong answers are. We need to dive very deeply into those results so we can get the most value from them. And that gets to something else that a lot of parents are really interested in. For some reason, I have a lot of students whose parents are just like, you got to take a practice test every week, 2 times a week. That's crazy. That was crazy back in the day when we had dozens of practice tests to go from, but it's even more crazy now that we only have a few to work with. So you cannot do this. Practice tests are very important, so we can't just keep doing them back to back to back. They are part of our prep, but there are other things that we're going to need to do in between. We need to target our weaknesses. So if you get a trigonometry question wrong, you can't just go to the next practice test and try to get the trigonometry question right that time. You've got to target trigonometry in between and just work on trigonometry practice so that you can improve. Then hopefully the next time you see that trigonometry question, you're all set. So we've got to target those weaknesses in between. We can't just dive right into the next practice test without trying to improve what we struggled with on the previous practice test. And the hardest thing to deal with as you're scheduling your practice tests is accidentally spoiling the tests. So if you're just like Googling or looking at other sites, you might encounter these practice test questions. And once you see them, once you see how to solve them, how to answer them, then it ruins it. And then now when you do take a practice test, your score is not an accurate representation of where you are because you kind of already knew the answers. So first of all, do not go to the linear practice tests from the College Board. Do not use the College Board's question bank. Those would be lazy resources that are not effective. They are going to spoil those practice test questions from the Blue Book app. So you cannot go to those. I talk about that in another lesson. But also be careful with third-party resources from other companies. They're going to sometimes do the same thing and just repurpose these practice test questions. And if you ever are handed a paper and pencil SAT, be very careful of where it came from. There's a very good chance it's one of those linear, non-adaptive tests that is going to spoil the digital SAT adaptive tests for you. And that's a really big problem because then again, your scores are not going to be accurate. Remember though, if you use my channel, I will never, ever, ever spoil an official question without warning you first. It'll always be very clear that these are official questions from practice tests. Everything else that I give you will be original. It will be something that is either an original College Board question or one of my own that tries to get the same point across without wasting the practice tests. So now we know what to watch out for. Let's talk about what we should do. There are basically 4 phases of SAT prep, and I'm going to talk specifically about how practice tests fit into those phases. Number 1, like I said, don't just dive into a practice test. You got to learn some stuff first. So I've got a 10-episode strategy series. There are plenty of other places to talk about SAT strategies. You need to get that big picture overview of the test so that you can learn new ways to approach questions that are different from what you did on the PSAT. So start with that, learn those strategies, learn how the trap answers work so that when you actually do take a practice test, you are already improving because you're already trying new things. So about halfway through your prep, yes, you should be taking a practice test. Take it seriously, take it just like the real thing, take it in the Blue Book app, and you should spend plenty of time reviewing it. It is not just about those scores, it's about what we can do differently next time so we can improve those scores even further. And that is why step 3 is to target your weaknesses. As you review the test, you will learn certain topics that you struggled with. You need to then find resources that target those topics. Khan Academy is a great place to do that, and it won't spoil the official questions. So I've also got resources on my website and on my channel that will help you with that as well. But you've got to make sure that in between your practice tests, you are actually working on your weaknesses and trying to turn them into strengths. And then about a week or 2 before your final exam, your actual real SAT, you're going to take a second SAT practice test. And again, try to be as thorough as possible with the review. Take it as seriously as possible so that way it feels like a dress rehearsal for the real thing. Overall, this 4-phase plan only needs to take about 8 weeks. That's about 2 weeks per phase. And that makes sense. Even reviewing a practice test, taking it and reviewing it should take about 2 weeks if you're doing it right. So I'll have another lesson that goes into the details of that. But if you do find yourself with more time or you don't feel quite ready for your real exam, you can repeat steps 3 and 4 if necessary. But remember, every time you take a practice test, you're taking one away from the future. Most people take the SAT more than once. So if you run out of practice tests on your first SAT, then what are you going to do if you want to take the SAT again? Odds are good you're just going to be stuck retaking old exams, and that is not a good way to gauge your progress and look at your scores. So hopefully this is enough to get you started. Basically, like I said, just 2 practice tests for 8 weeks is enough if you're doing everything else right. So don't feel like you're selling yourself short by only doing 2. It's better to do those 2 right than to just keep doing practice tests for the lack of anything better to do. So if you subscribe to my channel, if you visit my website, I'll give you plenty of other stuff to do in between. It's always good to take the practice tests seriously and to balance them with other types of prep. So again, I will have a longer lesson on how to review practice tests in a much more thorough way. So make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss that. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, when it comes to your scores, don't settle for less, Settele for more.